Thank you so much excuse me, for that introduction. I am truly honored to be here this evening, both at Pacifica and at Pilgrim Lutheran. This edifice here is really lovely. I do want to thank my brother from another mother, Mr. John Nunez. We go way back. A lot of people don't know this, but we've been partners in theological crime together. One Presbyterian, one Lutheran. I haven't converted him yet, but I'm still working on your Calvinism, brother. It's still working on that. Since 1999, 2000, something like that, we've been doing this road show together. So I'm really delighted and happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation tonight. I have a little clicker here. Oh, there we go. Oh, that's me right there. Yeah. Oof, that's a heavy topic we're going to talk about tonight. The trauma of poverty, why economic empowerment matters. I want to set the stage by telling a story. And for those of you who have a little gray on your faces like I do, you will remember these days. All the way back, talking sort of late 80s, early 90s, in Washington, D.C., there was massive discussions about welfare reform. We got to do something about welfare, right? It's eating our country alive. There was a governor in the state of California by the name of Ronald Reagan in 1976, coined the phrase welfare queen. Took that same framework into the 1980s as part of the impetus to do something about welfare reform. We have to fix this. We have too many people living in housing projects, too many people who are living on the dole. We have to do something about welfare. And that discussion went on and on and on and on. And in 1996, Congress was able to, some say with a bit of encouragement, some may say a threat, to get Bill Clinton to sign the Welfare Reform Act of 1996. We went from AFDC, aid to families with dependent children, to TANF, temporary aid to needy families. And the big emphasis there was work. We got to get people back to work. There was a man by the name of Robert Rector, the Heritage Foundation. And at Heritage, Robert Rector was at the forefront of helping to shape policy in D.C. on welfare reform and getting people back to work. And the thought was, if we get people back to work, then we can restore marriage and family and faith and those sort of things. But work was considered really vital in that, and the data showed it. Right? One of the best ways, this is not going to be too extraordinary to think about, but one of the best ways to not be poor is to have a job. Wow, okay, I'm done. Questions? All right. And so we want to get people back to work. But what we didn't realize, perhaps, is that there may be reasons why people find it difficult to get back to work. And not just difficult to get back to work, but difficult to stay at work and to remain employed. And that's where I think a lot of conservatives lacked a lot of compassion. And that may be where the welfare queen framing that Reagan introduced in 76 and reintroduced it in the early 1980s might not have been entirely helpful, because the reason that people find themselves stuck and trapped in cycles of poverty is complicated. And what I've come to see over the years is that it is multivariate. There are multiple reasons why people tend to ladle in and out of poverty. Multiple reasons. It's not just because they're lazy or they made bad decisions, but sometimes things happen to people that undermines their capacity to work and stay employed. And people God's people with compassion. We need to be looking at all of the variables and not just picking one or two. Some of the variables, this is something I'm working on. You can't really see it that well right now, which is perfectly fine. I'll offer it up as a tattoo that you can get later to sort of get the revolution going. But I want you to see this. These are sort of 12 things I've identified over the years that really do impact poverty and keep the poverty tree alive. I think what happens often is that we want to end poverty, which is great. And what people want to do is just chop down the poverty tree without getting to the roots of poverty. And the roots of poverty are really multivariate. Here are some of the things I've seen over the years of this project I'm working on. It includes these things, and sometimes more of these than others, but it includes things like adult criminality. I mean, sometimes people are poor because they're criminals, right? And they break the law and end up in jail and have a record, and that's why they're poor. So we have to work on that. Other issues of dad deprivation and family structure. We know this. I mean, I have a whole presentation just on the social implications of fathers. We know that fathers are central to economic flourishing, period, right? In fact, and I'll get to this at the end, the best defense against child poverty is a dad, period. And one of the questions is, how do we get policy, particularly at state legislatures, but also in D.C., to really support and bolster fathers? Fathers are so radically important. I'd love to come back next year and just do a whole thing on fathers, because fathers are really, I'll say it this way, and then I'll move on. Fathers are the most important men in any community ever, period. Right? I was just speaking at an all-boys school in Memphis, super posh, $25,000 a year for 6th grade. Right? And I told the lads this: you want to change the world? Yeah, you could be an engineer, you could be a doctor, whatever. Just be a good dad. That's all we need. Right? We had a culture of good dads. A lot of this stuff, that tree would disappear. So dad's really important. Childhood trauma, which I'm going to focus on tonight. Trauma tends to undermine people's capacity to thrive. And taking trauma seriously really does matter. I won't go into more there, but we'll talk more about that tonight. Poor education, bad schools, predictive, right? You can't read right, things like that. You below grade level, right, tends to keep people poor. Juvenile criminality, if you end up in the juvenile system at 14, 15, it's predictive. You're almost done without some massive interventions. Next here is unemployment, the inability to sustain employment long term. And by employment, I don't mean like working at Target. By employment, I mean a dignifying job with skill development. Build self-confidence with a pathway to advancement. The next is poor decision making. Some people make really bad decisions. Really bad decisions. Have some cash and they just buy something really dumb. We all do this at Christmas, right? And we all do this when we get our tax refund. We have to exercise some restraint because we want to just go buy something, and we probably should pay off a loan or two. But a lot of people are poor because they just have made a series of bad decisions, and their decision-making apparatus is somehow skewed, and there are reasons often for that. There are a lot of people who are stuck in the welfare system, and I was in Memphis, and they just spent millions of dollars on building this absolutely gorgeous, stunningly gorgeous, beautiful public housing. I'm driving by and I'm thinking, I would never leave. Right? They're gorgeous. Why would I leave that to go struggle and try to get a loan and get a house and have to go to Home Depot all the time? I'm just going to stay here, right? And stay in the nice public house. So some people are often stuck in those systems. Poor health and health care. I could do a whole long talk on diet, sugar, salt, carbs, and how that has undermined a lot of people's striving. We see this particularly in low-income communities: hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, right? A lot of that is diet. You see this particularly on Native American, reservations. Addictions, really bad. If any of you have an addict in your family, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Addicts make poor decisions, and sometimes those poor decisions keep them trapped and stuck in poverty. Geography is huge. There's a lot of data on this. This is hard for me to say, but sometimes by an act of providence, you were born in a neighborhood that set you up to thrive. And that some people are just born in the wrong neighborhood, and if they had been born in a different neighborhood, they'd be fine. And I thank God every day that my parents bit the middle class bug and moved us out to the suburbs and basically lived in the Shire. I mean, I had an absolutely wonderful childhood. It was iconic, right? The way I describe it is, leave it to Beaver, but everybody's black, right? That's exactly how I grew up, right? Everybody, 2 cars, garages. Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, everybody's backing on the driveway at the same time. Everybody's going to a different church. Okay, dads were at home. Everybody's mowing the lawn. I mean, it was barbecues, and it was great. It was fantastic. We had go-karts, and we had a cul-de-sac. We were right around our go-karts. The dads built a baseball diamond in the middle of the street. It was fantastic, right? And every kid in that neighborhood did great. But a few miles away in downtown Atlanta, people in a different neighborhood didn't do great. And they were in a different culture with a different incentive structure, right? Different things were celebrated by adults. And my neighborhood was celebrated as how many instruments can you play? How many languages do you speak? How many sports do you play? What are you going to do when you go to college? And that's being asked of 5-year-olds where I was growing up. So it's complicated, multiple variables, not just one, not just 2. I've got 12, this could be more, but it's complicated. And if we really want to get at solving issues like poverty, we have to not look at one thing, but all 12 of them. But this is the good news for me, is that it's complicated, but that also provides opportunities. Because you may not be great at addressing issues of addiction, but you might be able to be a tutor for a kid if you work in education, right? You may not be someone who can address issues of crime, but you may be a business owner who can provide economic opportunities and jobs. So the good news is it's complicated, and the better news is it gives us more opportunities to engage. And this is something that in the 1990s we weren't thinking that deeply about. And I can say I'm old. I had hair back then, and this was black. So I can say we in the 1990s weren't thinking too deeply about that. But I want to draw our attention tonight specifically to adverse childhood experiences. Now, any of you working in education, you've probably been exposed to this. But childhood trauma predicts struggle. I'll just say that again. Childhood trauma predicts struggle. And one of the greatest things that we can do for children is protect them from trauma. The largest study of its kind looks at the health and social effects of adverse childhood experiences over a lifespan. Massive study was done. The study was done in the mid-1990s. Over 17,000 people, and it was actually done here in the state of California. It was a partnership between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente in the San Diego, California area. And what's so fascinating about this study is that the adverse effects of childhood trauma was studied with middle-class people. Because it's traumatized middle-class kids that struggle as well. Not just traumatized low-income kids. But the study was done, the standard was done with middle-class kids here in California. The study participants were middle-class Americans from San Diego, 75% white, 75% attended college. The average age was 57, and it was split evenly between men and women. This was not considered an at-risk population. This was a population of people that on paper looked to be thriving, right? Jobs, right? Nice jobs, nice careers, nice houses, nice cars. This was a population that they did the research on. And here's what the research essentially showed. That child trauma and adverse childhood experience tends to predict early death. Childhood trauma predicts early death. We're going to talk more about the details here. But when a child experiences real trauma, it actually disrupts their neurological development. It changes the ways in which their neural pathways develop in their brain. We're going to talk about some of the parts of the brain and how that works. And that neurological impairment impacts social and emotional and cognitive development. So there's trauma, there's neurological deformities. Those neurological deformities become cognitive. They affect sort of social and emotional regulation. And that introduces, we're going to talk about this in some detail, the vulnerability to at-risk behaviors that tend to lead to poverty. And not just that, they lead to disease. They also ultimately lead to early death. Now, this is not determinative. It's predictive, right? This is not what I'm not saying is that if a child has trauma, they're going to end up dying early and make bad decisions to be poor. No, this is what I'm saying. What the data is saying is that we can make a prediction, an educated guess about where kids are going to end up if they experience these things early in life. So what are adverse childhood experiences? It's a mix of experiences and exposures in childhood that are major risk factors for certain illnesses and poor quality of life. They tend to be categorized into three subgroups. First is abuse, which makes a lot of sense, right? If a child is abused, they're going to have trauma, and it will escalate there. The second is neglect. And the third is family and household challenges. Family and household challenges include things like divorce, include things like a move in the wrong time of the child's life. I used to teach high school, I've taught college, I've taught seminary, and I cannot tell you the number of stories I've had of kids, young adults and students who said, my parents moved me in the 8th grade, and I never recovered. Or my parents moved when I was a senior in high school, and I never recovered, right? So sometimes those sorts of things can introduce trauma and have a traumatic impact on the child's life. So here's basically how the ACE score, the Adverse Childhood Experience score, works. You get one point or one score for every adverse event. And what the data shows, and remember, this is in middle class America. It's middle class America, right? This isn't inner city. This isn't Appalachia. This is middle class America who have college degrees and good jobs. Look at what that says. Only 35% of women and 38% of men made it through childhood without something. Think about that. 35% of men and only 30% of women were able to survive childhood without some sort of traumatic event. That's how rare it is to not experience some aspect of trauma. And of course, the question is, maybe we can do this in the Q&A. By the way, you have those QR codes. Feel free to use them throughout the talk. Why is it that some kids experience trauma and thrive, and some kids experience trauma and don't? Right? That's a really, really important question I'd like for us to maybe talk about together. So here are the types of things that can get you a ACE score. A physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. A physical or emotional neglect. A household mental illness. I cannot tell you. There's a fantastic book out called A Borderline Mother, and it explains exactly what happens to kids when the mother is borderline and not treated. And there's great books on narcissistic parents, narcissistic moms, narcissistic dads, great books on what happens when like a father's an alcoholic. Kids have to walk on eggshells because they don't know what kind of dad's going to come home that night. Those sort of things really do introduce trauma. Living in a household with substance abuse. As a college professor, I cannot tell you how many number of students who would tell me, and I taught middle class students, my parents are addicts, right? Cocaine, stuff like white collar kind of addicts. Having a parent or caregiver divorce or separate. Divorce is devastating, absolutely devastating. One of my friends, Brad Wilcox, has a great book out called Get Married. He is at the University of Virginia and runs a marriage and family institute out there. I'd highly recommend the book. It's just called Get Married, and really explains why marriage is important, particularly why marriage is important for kids. Really, really is devastating for children when their parents split up. Exposure to domestic violence has a massive impact on a child's brain. They see their mom or their dad get beat up by somebody in the home is huge. Living in a household where a member has been incarcerated or was incarcerated, the inconsistency there. Those are the things, and those add up over time. And look at this. In the study, 15% of women and 9% of men had 4 or more of those. Now, this is middle class, college-educated America. And these are the sorts of traumas that are a regular occurrence in those contexts. So these are the sorts of things that these sorts of traumas predict. You may not be able to see those too clearly in the back. I'll read them really quickly. Alcoholism and alcohol abuse. One of the things I noted when I taught high school is that when I taught at Christian school, and sometimes at Christian schools, parents bring their kids to our school to fix them. Did you know what I'm talking about? That's right. And often it was the case that the child had something happen to them the parents didn't even know about. And so sometimes our students were addicted to drugs and alcohol because they were self-medicating something that happened to them when they were really young. So alcoholism and alcohol abuse, sexually transmitted diseases, a chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so heart disease, depression, fetal death. It predicts fetal death. We'll talk about this in just a moment in terms of why that is. But I talked earlier about the need to protect children from trauma. We even much more so need to protect pregnant mothers from trauma because of what it does to their fetus, their baby. A health-related quality of life goes down: liver disease, smoking, unintended pregnancy, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, intimate partner violence. You may have heard the phrase that hurt people hurt people. Right? I can tell you from the research on men and masculinity that hurt boys hurt other people for sure. When boys get hurt, they tend to act out. When girls get hurt, they tend to hurt themselves. So what I've seen over the years, both at the college level and high school level, is that girls will cut themselves and things like that, eating disorders, things like that. Boys will go shoot up a school, burn something down, rob something, right? Or later on, they will abuse their wives and their children. Hurt people, so intimate partner violence, ischemic heart disease as well. And again, look at the percentage. In the study, only 36% of people had nothing. This is how common it is. So we want to think about why it is that some people are able to thrive and some don't. I want to park here for just a second because we talk a lot about abuse, sexual abuse, and those things are actually quite normative. But the majority of childhood trauma is actually neglect. It's not abuse. It's not physical abuse. It's not a sexual abuse. It's actually deprivation. It is children not having their needs met. That's the majority of what constitutes child maltreatment. In fact, this data, which was 2018, shows that 75% or so this is 2016, about 75% of the ACE scores were related to neglect. I've recently seen updated data that it's up to the early 80 percentile, maybe 83, 84 percentile of childhood maltreatment is deprivation. Now, what is deprivation? What is neglect? It's things like this: failure to meet the child's basic needs. So children who struggle with hunger, children that are dirty, children that don't have proper clothing, children that find themselves unable to have proper shelter, kids who are unsupervised. And this can happen in ways in which you might not imagine. So we often don't realize that when parents are pursuing their best life, that sometimes they leave their kids unsupervised. I'll give you a great example of this in Manhattan. I was on a subway. I like to eavesdrop because I'm nosy. And there was a parent talking to her son, and he was asking if his friend could come over for the weekend. And she's like, yeah, of course you can come over for the weekend. And she's like, by the way, why does he come over for the weekend? And he said, well, his parents leave him, he's 8th grade, and his parents leave Manhattan to go out to the Hamptons every weekend, not every weekend, multiple weekends a month, and they leave him at home by himself, unsupervised. And so the 8th grader took the initiative to say, I need to be in an adult community. Can I come over to your house over the weekend? Unsupervised existence actually creates a lot of anxiety. Imagine being 13 years old, living in New York City or in your house by yourself over a whole weekend, and you have to meet all of your needs at 13. Now, 17, 18, go away. Have fun. Right? But at 13 years old, think about all the things that could happen, right? Give a list of numbers. If you get in trouble, call this, do this. A lot of pressure, things like that. Kids not having their health care needs met as well. Huge implications here. What we see here is it doesn't take much in terms of the length of trauma with children to have these predictive results. First 36 months. That's it. 36 months of ACEs predicts these struggles. If you look at what this data is showing here, in terms of developmental delays, as you increase the number of childhood traumatic events, you you increase the number of developmental delays. So if you have one or two of them, you have a 20% chance of having some sort of developmental delay that is born out of the first 3 years of life. If you have 7 events in the first, think about this, right? If you have 7 events in the first 36 months of life, it is a 100% likelihood you're going to have something. We have to protect children. We have to protect children. We have to protect them. Everything that we can do to protect kids. Because if we do this, they won't end up in the juvenile system or in the criminal justice system or on welfare later. We really have to do as much as we can to protect children. Again, these are some of the things that adverse childhood experiences tend to produce. Right? This graph here, you can't see some of the writing there, but the basic framework is this. ACE scores go up, likelihood of injury, including traumatic brain injury, more likely to have fractures, more likely to be burned, mental health issues, so more likely to have PTSD, anxiety, suicide, etc., depression. Maternal health is often compromised, more likely to have an unintended pregnancy, fetal complications as well. Infectious disease comes out of childhood, adverse childhood experiences. Again, chronic disease, cancer, diabetes, alcohol abuse, unsafe sex, risky behaviors. Education outcomes decline, and so do opportunities decline. And this all comes out of childhood trauma. This is Wendy. She lives in a homeless encampment in Portland. So when you think about trauma and poverty, this is the face of childhood trauma in America. It's Wendy. Now, what happens sometimes is that we see Wendy, who is homeless and on drugs, and we think, man, she needs to get her life together, right? You know, if she were just more responsible, like us, then she wouldn't be here. What she needs to do, right, is get her faith together, get back to work, right, exercise some pro-social norms. Right? But look at her. She's strung out. She's lazy, making bad decisions. And this is what the data shows. There's a physician who works with populations like this in Western Canada, and one of the things that he noted in his research, this is over sort of two decades, he's never, ever met a homeless, drug-addicted woman who was also not sexually abused as a little girl. He said he's never, in over 2 decades of working with populations like this, never seen a woman who is homeless and on drugs and was not sexually abused when she was a little girl. He's never seen that. So here's what this means, in part. That helping people get back to work also means helping them with their trauma. Helping them heal their trauma. Heal from their abuse. Heal from whatever it is that created the predictive pathway for them to end up struggling, like Wendy. Now, here's what's fascinating to me. I'll get preachy for just a second here. This is what was really fascinating to me about Jesus. I'm in a church, I can talk about Jesus. So my own training is in theology, and I'm a huge Thomas Sowell fan. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Thomas Sowell. He's an economist at Stanford. Anybody heard of Thomas? Okay, great. I have some correspondence between the two of us. You know, we've kind of wrote, I guess, me, Thomas Sowell, Budge, go back. I've written 2 books on Thomas Sowell. And sometimes the debate becomes about ideology, right? The left is wrong, the right is right. We got to fix the policy and have this ideological culture war, and that's how we get toward these solutions. So sometimes we come across Wendy and we see a policy issue. And we think, oh, we need to fix, we need to get poverty programs right so we can help people like Wendy. And sometimes the discussion really isn't about policy. What's really different, I think, for Christians is it has to be about people. Not about the ideology first, although you can have your opinions, but it has to ultimately be like people, because what Jesus does when he sees women like Wendy, he doesn't look and say, look at what the left did. Right? Or he doesn't look at Wendy and say, oh, you know what? It was the lack of compassion on the right. That's what did that. Right? If those right-wing Republican conservatives actually love people, then Wendy, that's not what Jesus does. Jesus looks at Wendy with compassion first. I'll just highlight one verse from Matthew chapter 9, verse 36. When Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless. Harassed and helpless. The Greek word for harassed is skolo. It means to be mangled, to be torn apart, to be cut to the bone. That's what harassed means. And helpless. The Greek word there is ripto. The Greek word ripto means to throw to the ground, to discard. So Jesus looked at the crowds and he saw a bunch of people who had been mangled, torn apart, cut to the bone, thrown to the ground, discarded. And instead of saying, well, what kind of policy do we need to fix them, he had compassion on them first. So one of my invitations, I think what's really exciting, at least for Christians, is to think about solutions not in terms of who has the right policy or the right ideology, but who's doing what's right for people that are made in the image and likeness of God. Because Wendy is a person first. And we have to love her according to her story if we're going to help her according to what she actually needs. And by the way, I love having the ideological debate. It's fun. It really is fun, right? And I've got some Thomas Sowell ammunition that I like to pull every now and then just to shut people down. It's great. But ultimately, Wendy doesn't need me to talk necessarily about minimum wage policy. She needs me to help her heal from her trauma as a child so she can be self-sustaining and make really, really good decisions for herself. So we often, and this is, by the way, this is really, really big in the 1990s, personal responsibility, right? People need to be responsible so that they can make good decisions and get back to work and stay out of poverty. But here's the problem. One of the challenges is that sometimes personal responsibility is compromised by a traumatically injured brain. So trauma undermines the development of brain regions that would normally help children make really good decisions. A traumatic brain, a traumatized brain, struggles to regulate emotions like fear and anxiety and aggression. Hurt people hurt people. A traumatized brain struggles to maintain focus on necessary that are actually necessary for learning and solving problems. A traumatized brain struggles to restrain impulses and regulate restrain impulses and regulate their physiological response to threats, which helps them evaluate situations and take protective measures. A traumatized brain struggles to make good decisions and also struggles with impulse control. And this has so much to do with particular brain regions. We'll look at some of these regions here. The amygdala, which is that blue circle there at the bottom of this diagram, that's a part of your brain that is involved in the processing of emotions, fear responses, and becomes enlarged and hyperreactive under stress and trauma. So it is hyper aroused and overactive. An overactive amygdala will make bad decisions. The hippocampus, which is that green area there under the amygdala, is crucial for memory and learning. And when a student is traumatized, their hippocampus shrinks. So one of the things when I was a ninth grade teacher, I had this one Puerto Rican student. His name was Janito Colon. He is absolutely brilliant. In fact, one of the smartest kids in the whole class. And I will never forget one day he came to school and he didn't have his homework. He was a bit disheveled. And, I'm at a high-performing Christian school, and we got to get this stuff done, right? We have to get you ready to apply to Harvard, for crying out loud, right? He didn't have his homework, and so I'm asking him, I took him outside, and I'm like, listen, you need to do your homework, because if you don't do your homework, you're not going to get good grades. If you don't get good grades, you're not going to get into Princeton. If you don't get into Princeton, you're not going to have a great life. It was sort of how we rolled there. In God's name, amen. And I remember he looked at me and he started crying. And he started crying because the day before, he had to step over police tape of a dead body, and there was blood on the sidewalk to get into his house in Philadelphia. And so his ability to concentrate in school, his ability to have reading comprehension was diminished because of the trauma. Smart kid, but his environment really did undermine him. It was really, really tragic for me to see that. The frontal lobe, we know a lot about this because we often joke about guys and their frontal lobe. But the frontal lobe there is responsible for higher cognitive functions such as decision-making, impulse control, and under trauma, a traumatized brain, a traumatized frontal lobe is small and less active. So sometimes, your 14-year-old does something really stupid, guy, and you're like, why'd you do that? He's like, I don't know. He actually doesn't know, right? Frontal lobe is not quite developed yet. Sometimes the data shows it doesn't really develop to their early 20s, 19, 20, 21, 22, depending on, could be 28, depending on if you were coddled by your mom. Could be way, way late. The corpus callosum, and that's the part of your brain, I've already split your head open, there is one piece of brain material that connects your left and right hemisphere. That is the corpus callosum. And this facilitates communication between these parts of your brain. And under trauma, that shrinks. So we have brain scans, by the way, that actually show this. Right? Now, this, by the way, I love this part because I was a biology major in college. And I don't get to use it that much. And so I love geeking out on this part right here. I used to be a chemist, so I'm like, Mom, Dad, see, I am using it. Great. I really am. Thank you for the paying cash for me to go to college, because actually they did, because back then you could pay cash and go to college. So think about what this means. A traumatized brain with a smaller frontal cortex, smaller amygdala, smaller hippocampus, a smaller thalamus, which is that part there in the middle, which also deals with mood regulation. That all of these things are not functioning that well, and so this impedes people's capacity to make good decisions and to do good things and do the right thing, and that is created often because of trauma to them. Remember, these traumas include things like sexual abuse, neglect, seeing violence, divorce, things like that. So in the literature, we talk about chronic stress. Cortisol here is the stress hormone, and this is why it's really important that we have to protect pregnant mothers. We have to do that at all costs. Because when a mom experiences chronic stress and she's pregnant, guess where that cortisol goes? Right to her baby. It's in her blood. And so if mom is really stressed out, the baby is also stressed out. And if the mom and the baby is stressed out, sometimes what happens is that can lead to fetal death. So this stress hormone, keeping this hormone low, is massively, massively important. And in the context of trauma, chronic stress is high. Everything's working on overdrive. And parts of your brain that involve good decisions are also shrinking. So again, what does this lead to? It leads to traumatic brain injury and depression and unintended pregnancy and risky sexual behaviors and cancer and diabetes and alcohol abuse and drug abuse and not paying attention in school and low grades and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes you say, oh, that school is bad. I'm like, well, is the school bad, or is the school full of kids that have been exposed to trauma? Maybe that's why the grades are so low. So trauma impedes brain development. Poor brain development undermines the capacity to have good executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills is the birthplace of a thriving life. I tell parents all the time, one of the best gifts that you can give to your kids out of high school is this: good executive functioning skills. Because if they have good executive functioning skills, when they go off to college, even if they go to ASU, which is a terribly debaucherous school, they'll make good decisions. These include things like planning and organization and task initiation and being flexible and being able to focus and have attention, to have impulse control, self-control, metacognition, thinking in abstractions, working memory, time management, perseverance, pushing through hard things. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that a 6-week program or just a weekend program with kids that experience trauma is not enough. When they experience trauma, they need to have their executive functioning skills refashioned, reshaped, set free, supported, so that when they come out of the program, they make really, really good decisions. So again, what does it produce? What does it lead to? It tends to lead to the types of things that undermine people's capacity to stay out of poverty, right? Alcoholism, STDs, heart disease, depression, unintended pregnancy, suicide, whatever. This is why the people part matters more than the policy part, getting that right. We have to get the people part right first. Did anyone know who this is? Patty Millett? Anyone know who this is? This is a fantastic success story of what happens when the right interventions are introduced when someone experiences childhood deprivation, neglect, poverty, and abuse. Patty Millett, by the way, she's a great author now. She's a nationally recognized speaker, goes on tour, and things like that. When she was a young girl, she grew up in a very abusive home. Her parents split up. And when, from the ages of 5 to 10, she was brutally sexually abused for 5 years. And after the age of 10, so getting through middle school, by the age of 15, she was suicidal. So at 15 years old, Patty ran out into the street to get hit by a truck, and the driver of the truck swerved and missed her. And so they put her in an institution because she attempted suicide. And there's a ministry called Youth for Christ. Has anyone heard of Youth for Christ? You heard? Okay. So there was a volunteer with that ministry, Youth for Christ, who would visit Patty in this institution, and the food there was horrible. And so he would bring her like KFC and Taco Bell, and she was eating it up. And he would tell her things like this: God loves you. Right? God forgives you. God doesn't see your past. God wants to heal you. God wants to put you back together, set you free, use him for his kingdom. Right? Jesus is here for you. And over time, she committed her life to Christ. And so when she came out of the facility, now as a Christian, her life was really, really different. But then something happened. The lifestyle pulled her back in. Stress, pressure pulled her right back in. And then she got back involved in drugs and alcohol because you know what hadn't changed? The trauma was still there. So what happens is when children experience trauma and they're doing well, if they have a stress experience, it can relapse really quickly. This is one of the challenges with addiction. Right? So she got back involved in drugs and alcohol, and then she found herself pregnant. And of course, naturally, right, 18-year-old girl is pregnant. Part of the recommendation was to have an abortion. She chose not to do that because at the time her boyfriend was going to remain with her. After her son was born, the boyfriend split. And so here she is, a single mom with this baby, all this trauma. She's trying to live out her faith. And the thing that allowed her to survive was the church. The church came around her, and they fed her, and they made sure she had housing, and they would visit her, and they would help her raise her son, and they loved her son, and her son grew up loved by all of these adults. And it was the church that helped her persevere through all this trauma. She survived because of the church. Her son survived because of the church. Her son actually committed his life to Christ at the age of 6. Now, their life wasn't perfect, of course. Lots of struggles there, but the church got her through. This is her son. This is her son. And in 2021, this lad wrote about 60, this is a side project I have going on. He wrote about 60 or 67 devotionals on Instagram every day during the pandemic. This is what he says on this day. It had 1.3 million likes. I believe God is in control of every aspect of my life. I believe God loves me, and I'm always on his mind. I believe I am being led by God's Spirit and that I am protected and hidden from the enemy. I believe I'm forgiven every wrong action or thought in my past, present, and future. God is working everything that the enemy meant for evil, and he is working it together for good. Now, he bears witness to this, not because he read it in some great book. He bears witness to this because this is what happened to his mom. He saw this happen to his mother. And we know some of his own story. He was he was solid until sort of high school years and had his own struggles, and that's a separate conversation because he had some traumatic events happen to him as well. But he now is this major advocate for Christ, prays during his performances, does a lot of evangelistic stuff. But the hero of that story is this woman. And the hero of her life is the church that came around and allowed her to thrive. So this is why economic empowerment is so important when it comes to childhood trauma. Because children who live in two-parent homes that are protected and thriving are less likely to be poor and are less likely to experience a series or a battery of those adverse childhood experiences. So you can look here. The blue is the percentage of children living in poverty with a female-headed household, the red is a married couple. Economic empowerment is critical at the reduction of a battery of adverse childhood experiences. I started out with work. I want to go back to work because work actually is still important. Robert Rector got it right. We got it right in the 1990s, but we need to add some things in terms of thinking about what allows people to work well and stay consistently employed. This is from a Catholic encyclical, Laborum Exercens, 1981, Pope John Paul II. This is what he says: work constitutes a foundation for the formation of family, a family life. Work is a condition for making it possible to found a family, since the family requires the means of subsistence which man normally gains through work. Work and industriousness also influence the whole process of education in the family. And for every reason that everyone becomes a human being through, among other things, work and becoming a human being is precisely the main purpose of the whole process of education. So this is true. So one of the questions is, what is it that allows people to do this well, and what undermines people's capacity to do this really poorly and to struggle with work? So here are some takeaways here. If we want to really address poverty, we need to bolster three main institutions. One is marriage culture. What marriage does do a lot of things, both for the spouses but also for the children. We need to build and sustain fatherhood. And lastly, this is really the main point for tonight for me, is that we need to bolster full-time gainful employment. Got to do that. Here's why. For men in particular, gainful full-time employment arouses a nesting impulse. I've seen it again and again and again. I've worked with populations of men who are coming out of incarceration. And as soon as they get a job, and I don't mean at Target. I'm not slamming Target. They got great stuff. I don't mean some kind of minimum wage job. It's like, why does he do this work? No, I'm talking about a job that brings him dignity, that has some skill development, and there's a pathway to promotion. He wakes up, he feels like a man because he's going to work and he's doing some really important stuff. One of the men I worked with, he was a plumber's apprentice. And as soon as he got that plumber's job, he had just got out of prison, all of a sudden he's like, I want to get married. I want to get a house. I want to get an apartment. I want to bring this woman and all my kids into my house. You want to set men free to champion marriage and family? They got to get good jobs. Have to get great jobs. So the more full-time gainful employment we'll have, the lower the ACE scores are going to be in low-income and deprived communities. This is really, really, really important, these connections. So when we talk about trauma and poverty, what I hope that I did tonight was complicate it for you and make it more confusing, and to not allow us to have overly simplistic sorts of answers and solutions to problems, because it's highly, highly complex. The bad news is it's multivariate. But the good news is there are lots of opportunities for all of us to put people first in those variables. So you may not be able to open a business, but sometimes you just need to give a kid a hug. And the kid that gets a hug is the kid that's less aggressive, and the kid that's less aggressive is the kid that doesn't end up in juvenile detention, and the story goes on and on and on. We can love people out of trauma. And that's one of the things that Jesus came to do. Thank you very much.
Well, let's give it up one more time for Dr. Bradley. That was a whole lot to think about. We're going to take a few minutes for questions and answers. But first of all, let me say thank you for being here, and welcome to Santa Monica.
Happy to be here.
You were visiting from Grand Rapids. I have a daughter who is a senior in college in Grand Rapids, so thank you. I know the sacrifice you're making coming to Santa Monica in February.
Yes.
From Grand Rapids.
I was more than happy to leave the snow. It was snowing when I left, and I was like, bye, snow. Yep.
Well, we're having some good California weather for you, although it's going to rain by the end of the weekend, I think. So you've got a QR code passing around. Whoops. I'm not going to be able to do these two things at once. And I've got a Google Doc here, which if everything goes well, I'll be able to read some of your questions. But I wanted to start, so much to think about, those last three institutions you said that we need to strengthen. I wonder if you might offer an opinion on, it seems so overwhelming. What can public policy do? What are the ways that we argue so much about policy implications of certain things like welfare reform?
Yeah.
Like the crime bill and so on.
Yeah.
And I wonder what you think about public policy, the reach of public policy in addressing some of these issues.
Great question. I was recently speaking at I don't know if anyone's heard of Lila Rose and Live Action. It's a national pro-life organization. They have a national summit for state legislators, and they sort of get them together and talk about ways that policy can support life in single moms and in particular. And it's interesting because we often in this discussion talk about sort of tax incentives and structures and things like this in terms of bolstering those institutions. But I'm going to go back to that slide from Labora McPherson's. Is a lot of this has to do with the economic potential for gainful employment. And so my policy question is this: what needs to happen to increase economic empowerment in communities that are struggling? And secondly, what can be done to make sure that parents are present in their children's lives and creating context for flourishing? So that can go in two directions. On the one hand, there is a problem. It's called spatial mismatch. What that means is that the jobs are over here, and the people that need the jobs live over there. And often the entry-level, low-skill labor jobs that people need, they're so far from where they live that the cost of getting from here to there is so great, they just don't do it. So what can we do to make sure that economic opportunity is actually geographically located near the people who need it the most? And that often includes a lot of discussions about the ways in which policy undermines economic entrepreneurship in those communities, like tax policies, things like OSHA regulations, and things like that, right? The barriers to entry are too high. And so the low-skilled labor market moves out here where they have less restrictions. Right? So we've seen lots of urban areas and cities where the cost of doing business is so great, they just move out. Right? So that's one issue. The other issue, and this might be more of a middle-class issue, what needs to happen so that parents are at home more with their children, providing and meeting their emotional, physical, spiritual needs, etc. really fascinating point in the history of this country. The Industrial Revolution permanently changed parenting in this country, actually in the world. From the dawn of human history, so from Genesis chapter 1 and 2 to about 1830, 40, something like that, right? Up until that point, from Genesis to the early 1800s, when parents were sustaining life and when fathers were working, where were the children? Right there. They're right there. Right? And for the first time in human history, the Industrial Revolution took fathers out of the home. And so now you have, and there's great literature on this in the 19th century, it introduced something called adolescence. You may have heard that word. That word was invented because they were trying to figure out what to do with all these kids going out of control because dad wasn't at home. And so one question is, what can be done in terms of policy or in terms of economic activities and rhythm to make sure that we sort of flip the script in terms of time away from home versus time at work? So are there policies that can introduce incentives for businesses to send people home at 2 or 3 o'clock to be home with their kids rather than dad coming home at 5:30? Right? There's also really, really good discussions about family leave, not maternity leave and paternity leave. When I spoke at the Pacifica campus down in Orange County, I was talking about this, and I was surprised at this, but I said, maternity leave is great, paternity leave is really awesome, and I said, fathers probably need to take maternity leave when the kids are in middle school or high school, and the moms were like, amen. They erupted in applause, and I wasn't expecting. They were like, yeah, please, take it later, right? Take it in middle school, high school. So those are some of the things that I'm sort of thinking about. Is on the one hand, how do we introduce that economic context that arouse that nesting impulse for men in low-income communities in Appalachia, for example, but also in inner cities. But then secondly, what sort of policies can be created to help bolster parents' presence at home with their kids?
Well, it sounds like a cultural shift too, because you're suggesting that maybe we don't need to make quite as much money as we think.
Or maybe we can be more productive at work.
That too.
Right? Yeah. I mean, the amount of time, if you're in a corporate setting, there's a lot of wasted time. A lot of people talking in the office about nothing, right? Absolutely nothing. A lot of wasted time. You're sitting in your cubicle, whatever, shopping, right? Just get work done, go home.
All right, well, we got a ton of questions here, so I'll move quickly. So what about the role of schools? I think you referred to this a little bit, given your experience. What about the role of schools in terms of childhood trauma? What is the role of schools? I imagine the question is in remediating,
like what can
preventing,
schools do?
Yeah,
that's a fantastic question. In my experience, and I say this as a former high school teacher, I think teachers play a crucial role can play a role in the healing process, especially for kids who are coming in homes where adults are not great. What being around great adults can do is stave off some of those predictive variables, right? And to sort of serve not as a solution, but to keep things from getting as bad as it could be, right? I think schools have great opportunities. In the Christian education, we talk about partnering with parents or partnering with the church, kind of partnering thing. But I think teachers really do have an opportunity to look out for kids who are struggling and try to get them some help. I think schools can really provide a safe space for kids to get help early interventions. And if I were on the board of a Christian school, I would devote a lot of money to having trained clinicians on campus so that students can get counseling help at school, with their parents' consent, of course, but they can get help while they're here.
Oftentimes, school might be the place where some of these adverse childhood experiences first come to light. I think that's been
Absolutely, yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah.
for a lot of people.
I mean, that was true for me as a high school teacher. I would get students telling me things that happened at home. I mean, I remember, I'll never forget my first year teaching high school. What I noticed is that the kids that got A's weren't always the smartest kids. The kids that got A's were the ones from the most stable homes. And I had some brilliant kids who got C's and D's, and their homes were chaos, right? I had one kid whose home was chaos. He did great. He's one outlier. He's brilliant, by the way. But yeah, he was one outlier. His name's Phil. Phil did great. But in terms of my first marking period, it was just clear, right? And I was heartbroken at that. And I think schools can serve as a place for kids to get access to that kind of help and provide a place for them to tell adults what's actually going on. And I remember this when I was a teacher. People would say to me, the older teachers, like, if a kid acts out in class, the first question we'd ask is, all right, what's going on at home? Right? That was the first question. The first question wasn't, why did you do that? What did you do? The first question was, okay, you just picked up a desk and threw it. Okay, so what happened at home? Right? And invariably, there was a story. Right. My parents were getting divorced. My dad left. My mom got drunk again. It was some story like that.
Right. I found in my career also that coaches, and especially for boys, I think, can play a
absolutely
really important role in affirming some positive masculine identities.
Absolutely, and they can most certainly serve as a surrogate father figure, right? To be that voice and that influence that the lad really needs. That's for sure. Yep.
So, what practical steps can churches, schools, and I'm sure other social institutions take to develop fathers?
Oh, that's a great question. Oh, man. If I had my laptop, I would plug it in and put like 12 slides. Oh, that's a wonderful question. Oh, that's a great question. So, guess what? Dads need support. They really do. They need a lot of support. And the support, by the way, includes things like this. And I do have a slide on this, so I'm pulling it up in my brain. Helping fathers be successful at their marriages. Well, the data is really clear on this, and as an educator, I'm sure you know this, that if you want to set up children to thrive, set their parents up to have a fantastic marriage, right? The stronger the marriage, the more the children thrive. It's a one-to-one correlation there. If we set fathers up with the resources to make sure that their marriages are strong, kids will be great. They'll thrive. Less likely to have ACE scores if the marriage is great. So what kind of things can churches do to help marriages thrive? Right? There's lots of things like counseling, of course, providing time for date night. I just saw some data, by the way, on date nights, that couples that have date nights are less likely to ever get divorced, ever. That's a regular thing. And listen, sometimes I'm critical of youth group. I shouldn't say sometimes. I'm a lot of times critical of youth group because the data is really clear that it doesn't work at all. But that's a whole different conversation. But if churches really saw a youth group as babysitting for the purpose of letting the parents go out and work on their marriage, I'm like, amen. Right. We will keep the kids for 2 hours and keep them busy and laughing and eating sugar and processed food and carbs, so that the parents can go out and work on their marriage. Amen, let's do that, right? In terms of support, so that's one thing. I think also dads need support in terms of counsel and advice on how to manage married life, work life, and parenting. Lots of resources for moms, not a lot of resources for men. I'm a part of a network of entrepreneurs, and this is what they do. It's a network of guys who meet and talk and text all the time, asking each other, how do you do this? How am I going to survive this? I've just started up my third company, and I've got 3 toddlers. How am I going to work this out? And it also includes opening up opportunities for mentorship. I think one of the tragedies of the way we think about retirement is that you retire and then leave and go play golf. And I've always been critical of that. I think retirees should stay and mentor the middle-aged men, right? And help them navigate managing teenagers and career and all those sorts of things. So men need a lot of support. And the the 6:30 breakfast on Wednesday from 6:30 to 7:30 isn't enough. Right. Or the 1-year men's retreat is not enough. Those are the sorts of resources I think that churches can really do to help bolster fatherhood and men in general. Right. Yep.
I love that. You mentioned in the Industrial Revolution the man make the locus of his economic activities outside the home rather than inside the home. Mm-hmm. I say that to my students in history class, that traditionalist statement, a woman's place is in the home. If you said that to a 17th, 18th century man, he'd be confused because that's his place as well. Everybody is in the home.
Yeah, he never would have agreed with that. Yeah.
And, another novelty of the 20th century is the nuclear family, and I'm sure David Brooks has written a lot about this. Mm-hmm. And when you mention retirement, multi-generational families are much more typical throughout history and around the world. So that's I love that. All right, this is a long question. I'm gonna do my best with it. On the poverty tree, where would you put societal or government policies that have historically disadvantaged classes of people, and specifically African Americans? And a lot of examples here, which I don't need to fill you in on: Jim Crow, redlining, and so on and so on and so on. The GI Bill, discrimination, segregation in higher education, etc.
Yeah, it's on the tree. So we talk about housing. There's a history of housing, right? That includes that. We talk about geography. There's a history of geography that includes that. Those are also, we talk about unemployment. That's on the tree. We talk about fathers and family formation. That's on the tree. All those things, if you think about the individual roots on the tree have their own social and cultural histories behind them. And we can tell the whole story about those things as they relate to those various roots on the tree. The narrative, particularly of social injustice, doesn't need to be a particular root because social injustice is a part of all of those because the devil is a part of all of those, right? And wherever the enemy is, what Justin Bieber's talking about, whenever the enemy is, you're going to have those levels of disruption and the attempt at destroying the goodness in the creation. One of my favorite theologians, Dutch theologians, is Gerard van Groningen. Dutch guy, his hands were the size of this backdrop here. He was a farmer in the middle of California, where there's a big Dutch settlement. And he would talk about the kingdom of God, but he also talked about the parasite kingdom. And this is the kingdom of the enemy that seeks to destroy all of the goodness that is in the creation. So the parasite kingdom finds itself attached to family structure, to housing policy, to employment, to geography, to economic institutions, right? Economic development, right? So it's the parasite kingdom that creates slavery and social injustice. So those sorts of things are a part of the narrative of explaining the histories of each part of those roots. Yes.
Well, we're going to run out of time here. It's getting late, so I'm going to bring Reverend Nunes to the podium. Last question. I think I know the answer to this. Do you give talks like this in public schools?
Not yet. I mean, I go wherever I'm invited. So if I go to a public school, I'm happy to do that.
I would hope you get invitations there and everywhere. What a pleasure it's been.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Bradley, thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Reverend Nunes is the pastor here at Pilgrim Lutheran. He is going to say a couple things and pray for us and get us out of here.
What a great evening this has been. Thank you so much, Anthony. And some of us are feeling the ravages of a long day and a long week. For Anthony Bradley, his body clock is on midnight right now. 3 minutes to midnight, so thank you. I am overwhelmed this evening in a positive way, in a life-giving way. John, you might call it a salubrious way. Overwhelmed in the first place with gratitude for our partnership with Pacifica Christian High School. Jim Knight, Eric Streelman, principal, Rachel Nyabadza, who I call the provost. I wish you could see what I see daily on this campus, the care that is provided for the students and the investment in their lives and the impact that this faculty and staff make. So we're extremely grateful for this partnership here at Pilgrim. Secondly, I'm overwhelmed this evening with appreciation for each and every one of you for joining a community, and your word, Jim, conversation this evening about a matter or matters that really matter. So thank you for being here, each and every one of you, this evening for the conversation. And it's a conversation that will not end at the conclusion of this evening, for sure. Thirdly, I'm overwhelmed. I wanted to add Matt. Can we thank Matt Mulligan for providing sound and the AV this evening? Thank you, Matt. Overwhelmed with praise to God for your gifts, Anthony. That mind, that scrutiny of the data, that interdisciplinary intellectual discipline, that liberating capacity to integrate thinking and then to communicate, like interestingly, compellingly, grippingly for us. Thank you for bringing so many ideas together in your own thinking, Anthony. G.K. Chesterton warned us that we need to beware of the clean, well-lit prison of one idea. You got 12. Thank you for that. In a society which prefers the easy echo chamber of non-nuanced singularity, your approach is incredibly refreshing. So thank you, my friend, for that. And this is entirely what you and I have had in mind for this entire series, whether it's Minchin or the other ideas that we have and are cooking up. And finally, on a personal note, and I say this to say that Dr. Bradley is not only a man of ideas, but someone who puts his faith where his words are, who lives these out. Monique is my wife and the mother of our 6 children and 12 grandchildren. And during some of the tough patches in our parenting, especially with our son, when he was navigating prefrontal cortex issues in his teens and early 20s, Anthony stepped up for us as a third parent. You know, every family needs a third parent, someone that your kids will actually listen to, someone who reinforces what we as parents maybe failed to fully impress upon our children. And so I thank you for that, Anthony. I'm overwhelmed this evening. This has been a great time together. There's only one more thing that would make the evening even more positively overwhelming for me. If some of you, this is my job, I have to do this, you know this is coming, would consider joining us here at Pilgrim Sunday morning, 8:30. Dr. Bradley will be leading Bible study here at 8:30 at Pilgrim on Sunday morning. And since you're here, we've got this thing we do at 10 o'clock. And we'd welcome you to join us for church as well on Sunday morning. But I'd like to conclude with a word of prayer. And Susan, is she still? Okay. She's the one who came 150 miles round trip to see you this evening. It's from the Book of Common Prayer, and it's for Compline. It's a prayer at the close of the day. And as you hear these words, think about the people and the faces of people who match some of these descriptions. Pray with me. Keep watch, dear Lord, with those who work or watch or weep this night. And give your angels charge over those who sleep. Tend the sick, Lord Christ. Give rest to the weary. Bless the dying. Soothe the suffering. Pity the afflicted. Shield the joyous. And all for your love's sake. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Bless your evening.